The bubble metropolis is all buildings based on spheres or bubbles. Sometimes they're in clusters and sometimes they stand alone. The materials are metals, coral, stuff based on plant life in the ocean, sometimes things from the surface world as well that fall into the sea, things like that. And below the bubbles are energetic roots that attach to the ground, and that's the plexus gel connection, which is an energy source. You have different science buildings based on high levels of technology and science. You have different warrior bubble dojos based on training and honing your different fighting and warrior skills. And also you have different places dedicated to music and dancing. And so this makes up most of the buildings and architecture of the bubble metropolis, which is the capital city of Drexciya.
Drexciya, the thriving, technologically forward community hidden somewhere deep on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean.
There are people swimming by on their own, also individual aquatic life forms, for example, sharks, squids, stingrays. Those are the different clans of Drexciya. And they're also riding modern-day futuristic kind of aquatic vehicles like the Drexciyan cruiser, which is based off the form of a squid.
Where the inhabitants are warriors integrated with aquatic life.
Their garments are long and flowing and hydrodynamic. In the warmer waters, they wear lesser clothes, and they're pretty much a free people and just living their lives. And their clothing is Afrocentric based, so definitely reflects the African roots.
Welcome to Tomorrow is the Problem, a podcast from ICA Miami's Art and Research Center, where we approach urgent issues of our time by unearthing the hidden meanings behind everyday phenomenon and ask how they might help us build a more liberated future. I'm your host, Donna Honar-Piché, and this season we're thinking with the ocean as a place of knowledge. In our last episode, The Sea is History, we looked at the very material ways marine archaeologists are uncovering long-buried stories among the petrified ruins of slave ships, and in the process finding new ways to honor the immeasurable losses of the Middle Passage. But what if those lives weren't lost? What if those casualties were actually survivors, and those survivors built another world on the ocean floor? A world where elemental and technological power have converged to create a society like nothing we've seen or heard before. In today's episode, we're going to tell you the story of Drexciya, its legacy, and how the sea isn't just a place of history. Its ebbs, flows, and underwater worlds not only carry, but craft the future.
This is Drexciyan Cruiser Control Bubble 1 to Lardosian Cruiser 8-203X. Please decrease your speed to 1.788.4 kilobonds. Thank you. Lardosian Cruiser 8-203X. Please use extra caution as you pass the Aqua construction site on the side of the Aquabahn. I repeat, proceed with caution.
The myth of Drexciya was born in the techno scene of Detroit in the 90s, and that voice you heard at the top of the show, he helped bring it to life visually.
Greetings, my name is Abdul Qaddim Haqq, also known as Abdul Qaddim Haqq. I've been a visual artist and illustrator for techno music for over 32 years now here in Detroit. Recently started doing graphic novels based on the music group Drexciya.
What is the one thing that you think that everyone should know about Drexciya?
The one thing they should know is that Drexciya is the greatest electro group of all time. That's the one thing they should know.
In 1992, two electronic musicians named James Stinson and Gerald Donald started releasing a series of concept albums and EPs under the name Drexciya. At the time, Abdul was fresh out of art school and already Detroit techno's go-to for cover art, including releases from now legendary acts such as Derek May, Juan Atkins, and Mad Mike Banks. Abdul met James and Gerald through mutual friends and eventually illustrated the cover of Drexciya's first studio album, Neptune's Lair. James and Gerald were private. They wore masks whenever they appeared in public, never once performed live, rarely gave interviews, and declined to comment directly on the narrative behind their instrumental soundscapes. 30 years later, Gerald still won't even confirm his involvement with the project. In fact, the origin story of Drexciya as we know it was only revealed as a series of cryptic questions in the liner notes of their double CD, The Quest.
Could it be possible for humans to breathe underwater? A fetus in its mother's womb is certainly alive in an aquatic environment. During the greatest Holocaust the world has ever known, pregnant America-bound African slaves were thrown overboard by the thousands during labor for being sick and disruptive cargo. Is it possible that they could have given birth at sea to babies that never needed air?
Present-day Drexciyans, we learn, are the water-breathing, aquatically mutated descendants of those pregnant women. Here's Abdul's retelling of Drexciya's genesis.
Well, the story of Drexciya begins during the slavery times, in particular the 1500s. Transatlantic slave ship was crossing the Atlantic and threw a pregnant woman overboard. This woman gave birth at the moment she was dying. An ancient being living in the ocean senses the life form, the newly born life form, and saves it. And she starts to save all the other babies from women that were thrown overboard. And eventually they become a community of warriors. And eventually they become unified and create the country of Drexciya.
Can you walk us through a day in the life of Drexciya?
Well, that's sort of complicated. It's such a large and multifaceted society. But if you're, say, a scientist, for instance, you'd wake up in your little bubble house or whatever, and you'd swim to the science academy or to your laboratory, and you'd work on research for most of the day and try to come up with new inventions, new technology. If you're a warrior, you'd wake up in your bubble barracks or something of that nature, and you might do some physical combat training like aqua jiu-jitsu or aqua capoeira, different aquatic martial arts. Later on in the day, you might train with weapons, and you might work on different strategies. So it depends on who you are. And the regular people, they live their own lives too. Merchants, farmers. I mean, it's a big civilization.
James and Gerald built an entire underwater world through lo-fi 808 drum machines, dark swirling synthesizers, and enigmatic snippets in the form of song titles, maps, and liner notes. Ever since, their mysterious creation has captivated fans and inspired fellow artists with its striking nautical imagery and the potent counter-narrative it offers.
The oceans are muchly deeply unexplored, and there was an estimate of maybe over 2 million people that were thrown overboard throughout the transatlantic slave trade, and that's probably a large underestimate. So those are just millions of people we'll never know who were human beings, had families and things like that. So there's a dark void in that in itself. I wanted to give a version of the story, of a new story where those people can have some sort of life again. I think that's what Drexciya speaks about ultimately.
Drexciya effectively transformed the horrors of the Middle Passage into a portal, thus creating an opening out of the dark void, and turned the ocean itself into a vessel for their collective Afrofuturist project, one that Abdul still contributes to today, with his ongoing series of graphic novels set in Drexciya.
All my life, I grew up with slave stories and different slave tales, and there's really an emphasis on slavery and how horrible it was, of course. But I believe after years of seeing only programs like that and shows like that, it creates a certain type of one-sided look at things. And so I wanted to try to turn the whole story around and create an empire based on strength, based on warriors, based on a science that emerged from this horrible thing that happened in humanity. And these people could overcome this impossible situation and become the greatest version of humanity themselves and aspire to create a great country and kingdom and empire for themselves.
James Stinson passed away in 2002. And although he still produces music, and Abdul told us enjoys the comic books, Gerald has stayed out of the spotlight. So Abdul has become one of Drexciya's unofficial ambassadors, along with an incredibly ardent fan community, including the Drexciya Research Lab blog.
Because the music was so outstanding and extraordinary, it definitely leaves an impression. And then they had the backstory, which even gives it more power. And with those combined, it places you in a sphere that not many have gone to. And Drexciya is one of those groups that have become legendary because of the music and because of their story. So it's really amazing. And I'm glad that it continues to this day, and I'm hopefully going to continue to develop it into more and more levels and carry it forward, hopefully.
As Drexciya's oceanic Afrofuturism has taken hold in popular culture, the lore has become much bigger than the band or its visual identity. It evolved into a kind of communal world-building exercise, with each contributor bringing a new level of depth to the city's backstory and sense of stewardship over Drexciya's legacy. In the 3 decades since Drexciya first emerged, an entire generation of artists has grown up with Drexciya and are now creating works in conversation with the mythology they put forward. From Ellen Gallagher's watery ecstatic series of watercolor paintings, to sculptors like Matthew Angelo Harrison, to the speculative fiction Binti trilogy by Nnedi Okorafor, soon to be turned into a Hulu series. To performance artist Aisha Hamid, who brought her audiovisual essay Black Atlantis, Retrograde Futurism to ICA Miami in 2021. And then there are the musicians carrying Drexciya's legacy forward.
When I first heard Drexciya, I was just like, yeah, this is it. Like, totally.
DeForrest Brown Jr. is a New York-based writer and techno musician.
Yeah, it was my freshman year of college, just after the 2008 crash. You actually couldn't hear a lot of Drexciya tracks because they were still like kind of on vinyl and hadn't been reissued. So it was kind of one of those things where the copyright was all locked up. But then Clone Records, a few years later, I think around 2010, started to reissue a lot of these Drexciya tracks. In like the CD, The Quest, which is pretty hard to find now, there was this map inside. And I didn't see this in the Clone reissues that you can, find on Spotify, Apple Music and such, which was a little disturbing to me, given the fact that in this first panel of the map, you see like the slave trade from 1655 to 1867 to the end of the Civil War. But 1655 is actually the year when the first corporation, the Dutch East India Company, dropped off the first 100 Africans here in New York at the seaport in Manhattan. And this Dutch record label decided to release the Drexciya tracks in full, out of order, without any of this information. And the irony of it really never left me. And that kind of began my interest and love affair with Drexciya as a myth.
DeForrest's upcoming book, Assembling a Black Counterculture, draws the link between Drexciya's oceanic setting and reclaiming techno's roots in Detroit. Because, while the city Drexciya is fictional, Detroit's material culture was foundational to James and Gerald's music, starting with the land itself.
So the book I've been working on actually traces this entire map from beginning to end. So you see like the slave trade from 1655 to 1867. The second panel is the migration of rural blacks to northern cities from the rural South from the 1930s and 40s. And that's kind of where Detroit comes in. And there's a weird link between Detroit and the South for a number of things. One, it's the soil. There's a neighborhood in Detroit called Black Bottom where a lot of like early jazz records and Black-owned record labels were founded, like Chess Records in the 1930s. That area, Black Bottom, has the same type of like fertile soil as the Black Belt. So down in like Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, which is like, where a lot of like cotton was grown, picked, and distributed over to Europe to, get the fashion industry started. And that's something that James Denson from Drexciya, I think, was thinking a lot about, whether people kind of recognized it or not. But going a step further with that, you have the Ford Motors Company, which was financing many Black people. Like he was, building neighborhoods and kind of paternalistically building an economy for freed Black people up north, while working with George Washington Carver in the South in Georgia to finance plantations to, again, source this soil. And they were working on like alternative fuel sources together. That's been really interesting to me in the way that Detroit, the seventh city of America, kind of built these industries and interacted with the South. And it's this like city of the future for Black people.
DeForrest also helps us place Drexciya in music history, and at the same time points us to techno's legacy as a Black musical genre.
So there's a few things that kind of happened with Drexciya, or I'll say James Denson and Gerald Donald prior to Drexciya in the mid-'80s. Well, for one, when One Atkins, he was the first person in Detroit to get an 808 drum machine. At the time, like the drum machines weren't selling very well, like no electronic gear was. And it's really interesting because he was able to like basically buy an 808 drum machine from a pawn shop in a Korg MS-10 and kind of hotwire those two together because it was pre-MIDI and record straight into a 4-track recorder. And then take those recordings over to a vinyl pressing plant that was left over from when Motown was producing lots of music throughout the city. So Detroit, for me, and techno specifically, is a kind of post-industrial music, not just because of the sort of economic hardships that the city faced during, the Reaganomic era, but also because when Motown left after the 67 riots to move to LA, they left behind a bunch of hundreds of staffers, music engineers, music studios, record stores, vinyl pressing plants. There was this vacant music industry and music industrial complex that was sitting there. And that's a huge part of Detroit techno, is that folks like Mad Mike, he was actually in Parliament Funkadelic and was working, at Motown and doing studio engineering and things like that. And so Drexciya was able to, as a group, Gerald Donald and James Denson were able to kind of jump right into the ruins of this music industrial complex and create something new with the gear that they had.
As you can hear, Drexciya's version of techno incorporates all of these influences. The sounds we hear are simultaneously otherworldly and resonant of the mechanized noises found in a factory. This sonic collision fuses together contemporary Black labor in Detroit's industrial economy with the vision of a world in which, instead of being forced into slavery, Black people created their own techno-forward universe.
When Drexciya first signed to Underground Resistance, it was meant to be a kind of warfare music. It wasn't necessarily for people to dance to. And you can even kind of go back to like the liner notes that come with their 95 release on Warp, The Journey Home, where James Denson is like calling people out. He's like, no more DJing tracks. Like anybody can like DJ these tracks. He's like, let's take it back to the roots and make this like wild electronic music. This like really, I don't want to call it primitive, but just like, this like free jazz electronic music. And I feel like Drexciya really pushes the line with that, because I think a lot of people maybe wouldn't call it traditional techno because there's not the 4 on the floor that Europeans have attuned us to thinking is what techno is supposed to sound like, as opposed to polyrhythmic drumming and stereophonic synthesizer work.
Drexciya's sound may not resemble the European-style dance music that might come to mind when you hear the word techno, but DeForrest says that's a historical error, one he's trying to correct with his own musical project, Make Techno Black Again.
I mean, I want to treat techno as a high-tech Black music, as opposed to just a dance music. I know the ways in which they market and have picked apart the skeleton, if you will, of techno to sell as a dance music. And I'm trying to reach in and pull that stuff apart like a car and reinsert it and like literally like kind of lock its pieces back into the Black music continuum. So starting with these Negro spirituals, starting first in the 1600s, but then their updates in the 1880s, running them through the invention of jazz, through my hometown with Tuxedo Junction and the invention of the dance orchestra, running it through the northern iterations of jazz with Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and so on and so forth. Afrofuturism is a really complex literary and philosophical endeavor that encompasses many things, but mainly it deconstructs sort of Eurocentric understandings of time.
Katherine McKittrick is a writer and professor whose research looks at Black geographies and how texts produced by Black studies and anti-colonial scholars give us clues and pathways to think about liberation and freedom differently. Just as DeForrest pointed out that Drexciya deconstructs our Eurocentric notions of time, Katherine argues that Drexciya foregrounds a relationship to the unknown, in contrast to dominant European Enlightenment relations to the world that are about knowing and acquiring knowledge.
One of the beautiful things about music, a sonic kind of narrative, is that it's not always bound to intelligibility or knowing something.
Katherine is also, perhaps unsurprisingly, a huge Drexciya fan.
I love the music. I love the band. I really love their album, Harness the Storm. That's my favorite album by them. I've been thinking about it and writing about it for a decade or something like that.
Generally, imaginative works aren't considered part of archival history, but Katherine suggests that we can and should use fiction and fantasy to supplement what's been left out from the historical record. Because in the absence of archival narratives, creative work is fundamental to reimagining and understanding our past. And water, especially for the Black imaginary, is a space and channel for this imagining to take place. In this way, the mythology of Drexciya offers a site for exploring Black studies outside the historical archives available to us.
The way that the ocean and watery geographies animate Black studies is really, really meaningful. And Drexciya speaks to that. They provide us with a narrative where there is a group of, potentially rebellious subjects living in the water that will help us kind of rethink what liberation means. And that speaks to all those other kinds of watery geographies that emerge in Black studies. And then there's the kind of difficult work of water in Black history. So it could be drinking fountains, it could be public pools and things like that. And where we continue to see Black people disciplined in relationship to the water. So there's so much there. And I think for me, when I first started listening to the music and thinking about the liner notes and all that other stuff, there was just this kind of explosion of ideas and things that were already taking place within Black studies that emerged alongside the music that they were making. So it's almost like this perfect storm of how to think about racial violence and liberation simultaneously.
One of those ideas that was exploding into Black studies alongside Drexciya's formation is the concept of the Black Atlantic. In 1993, writer and scholar Paul Gilroy published a book called The Black Atlantic: Modernity and Double Consciousness. The book argues that the way we've historically thought about identity as being linked to nation-states doesn't adequately capture the intercultural and transnational connections produced in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade. Instead of a land-based culture like American, European, or African, Gilroy argues that a Black Atlantic culture amalgamates the experiences and impacts of those who were forcefully brought across the Atlantic during the slave trade. The idea of the Black Atlantic positions the Atlantic Ocean as a site for the melding and originating of a borderless Black diasporic identity, not just as a site of merciless violence.
The Black Atlantic is simultaneously a metaphor for Black livingness, or how Black people navigate the world in the diaspora as we sort of work out the living memory of slavery. So slavery is kind of haunting us. But what I also really like about the Black Atlantic is that it is a material geography. It is a physical geography. It's a watery geography. There is plant life, there is sea life, there are boats, there are ports, there are all these kinds of things that kind of reshape our relationship with geography. So the ocean kind of does all that work.
By studying Drexciya in relation to other kinds of texts like The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy, Katherine identifies the significance of water in theorizing the relationship between various histories of Blackness and diaspora. Drexciya plays with many of these ideas, although it's unclear if Gerald and James were directly influenced by Paul Gilroy, partly because their music, as Katherine put it earlier, gives us a largely wordless sonic narrative.
One of the reasons I was originally attracted to Drexciya is because it's non-lyrical music. if it is indeed providing a soundtrack to the terror of the Middle Passage or the aftermath of that terror of the Middle Passage, what does it mean that it doesn't have lyrics that kind of help guide us as to what that means, what that afterlife means, what the living memory of slavery means? What does it mean that there isn't an intelligible story that is paired with it?
Katherine says Drexciya's lyricless music draws the listener into a technologically electrified world that decenters the human and the optical.
Our preoccupation with optics, I think that's the best way to say it, to kind of see each other and see the racialized body and know what that racialized body means. And that includes the white body. And instead, Drexciya provides us with this soundtrack, lyricless soundtrack that asks us to enter into a conversation about race in a different way because they completely displace the body. And they also displace in their work, in their interviews, they talk about how they don't want personalities to get in the way. So there's this ongoing attempt by them to ask us to think about the world differently, even if it's just for a moment.
What do you think this sort of untethering from language does for feeling the music?
I think it creates an openness where the instructions are slightly different. That doesn't mean that there aren't instructions. They wrote the liner notes with the origin story or the cosmogony with intention for the quest. Like they gave us some instructions. And so they provided us with part of the story, and then the sounds and the songs without lyrics. I think we're asked to do a different kind of work because we have that origin story in mind, and then it takes us elsewhere without any map at all.
Just as Gerald and James chose to remain uncredited as Drexciya's creators, the oceans act as a kind of cloaking device, providing anonymity beneath its surface and activating various underwater powers, ecological and fantastical.
One way to think about that is to recognize the ocean as a space that isn't tied to land and to land thinking. It provides us with a grammar where it isn't about a belonging that is tied to a particular type of geography, like land geographies that are bound up in blood and exclusion and kind of crude forms of belonging. And instead, because of that distance from a version of belonging that's tied to the land, we might be able to kind of imagine new ways of belonging that are not so exclusionary, that do not rely on citizenship papers and data collection where you have to kind of fill out a box to become a particular type of person that can therefore belong to the nation and therefore stake a claim to land. The ocean kind of undoes all of that. It has the potential to undo all of that. So it's very kind of an exciting geography that takes us in a different kind of direction when we think about belonging.
This is where Katherine's work complicates the notion that Drexciya, while invested in what a future could look like, will tell us what that future is supposed to look like.
They don't provide us with an explicit map or a space of freedom, or even, I would argue, a future. Even though they're tagged as Afrofuturists, they don't necessarily say, this is what the future looks like, or this is what the past looks like, and this is what the community looks like, and we were free then, or we will be free in the future. Instead, they give us a future present. They kind of tell us that those slaves were thrown overboard and they survived, and they're with us, and they live among us right now. And that isn't necessarily a bound geography that they're providing. Like, it's not a bound space or a bound city. It's not an Atlantis. They're right here beside us. They're living next door to us, possibly. We could also think about how the story of Drexciya provides us with an alternative geography that works without the mandate for conquest, without the mandate for reproducing a colonial space as a location of safety, and instead is kind of invested in encounter and what we do with each other in the everyday world.
To Katherine, Drexciya's enduring power, the way its influence continues to ripple across culture, comes from embracing the ambiguities of the ocean. Anonymity, timelessness, free of land-based thinking, and even the linear narrative of progress that defines Afrofuturism. Instead of providing a traditional narrative of progress or a mythology grounded in a romanticized past like conventional renderings of Atlantis, Drexciya is positioned right alongside our everyday lives.
Afrofuturism is difficult, I think, because the term sort of implies a linear map. So past, present, future. And in the future, we will have a different sense of place or a different kind of community. So the future is the trick there. And it grammatically kind of gets us caught up in that linear way of thinking about the world. So Afrofuturism, if we think about Drexciya, so if it's not forward thinking, if it's not caught up in that linear organization of the world, Afrofuturism is meaningful because we live it now. And for me, that's about invention. It's about inventing new ways of living with each other. It's about inventing new sounds. It's about inventing new narratives, fictions, poetries, stories that we tell each other to get through the day or get through the week or whatever. And it's meaningful because that practice of inventing and reinventing the world is a mode of care, and it's a mode of survival, and it's experimental too. That's the thing, is that it provides us with an experimental logic that's about curiosity and wonder. It's not about necessarily knowing everything and knowing what the future will be or what yesterday was, but instead it's about taking risks and sharing knowledges about how we get through the world. So I think that's the important thing about Afrofuturism, is not to do the work that the word means, because I think that's where we get caught up, and instead think about what it's giving us now.
By taking place in an alternate present, Drexciya and the oceanic home from which it emerges forges a vital link between the submerged violences in the ocean floor and the Black identities that forge the future.
Cardozo and Cruiser 8-203X. You are now clear for docking. Have a nice stay here in Drexciya. I'm Drexciya and Cruiser Controller X205. If you have any problems, let me know. Bubble Control 1 out.
In our next episode, we'll approach these questions of identity and community across oceans instead of below them.
I think part of the emotional resonance of it is that then you feel like, oh, they didn't take everything away from us. They didn't just divide us completely with languages and locations and all these tools, but there's still something that's sort of unbreakable in our ties.
Tomorrow is the Problem is produced in partnership with Podfly Productions. This episode was produced and written by Isabel Lee and me, Donna Honarpiche, and edited by Francis Harlow. Our showrunner is Jocelyn Aram. Nina Pollock is our sound designer and mixing engineer. Thank you to all of our guests. You can learn more about Abdul's work at www.thirdearthvisualarts.org. Katherine's writing on Drexciya can be found in her book, Dear Science and Other Stories. You can also pre-order DeForrest's forthcoming book, Assembling a Black Counterculture, wherever books are sold. A huge thank you to Drexciya and DeForrest, who makes music under the name Speaker Music, for letting us use their work to score this episode. And a very special thank you to Munya Munyadi for being the voice of Drexciya's liner notes. And thank you as well to Bruno Hunger and Gregor Huber for letting us use their song Junk as our theme. I'm Donna Honarpiche. Thanks for listening.